March 23, 2018, 2:42 a.m. The Solomon Sea. A robotic claw descends through the crushing blackness of the iron bottom sound, kicking up a cloud of silt that hasn't settled for 75 years. The research vessel Petrel floats nearly a kilometer above, its crew huddled around glowing monitors, waiting for a ghost to manifest from the gloom. On the screen, the darkness shifts. A hulking, unnatural shape materializes in the high-definition beam of the remotely operated vehicle. It is steel, riveted and torn, coated in a thick crust of rust and deep-sea anemones. The ROV pilot nudges the thrusters, gliding along the port side of the massive structure until the camera finds what it is looking for. Etched into the stern, barely visible beneath decades of marine growth, is a number, 50. This is the USS Helena. For decades, historians and naval experts debated the final resting place of the ship the Japanese Navy feared more than any battleship. They called her the machine gun cruiser, a vessel that fired 6-inch shells with such terrifying speed and precision that enemy commanders were convinced the Americans had developed a secret automatic cannon. She was the first ship to receive a Navy unit commendation, a warrior that survived the inferno of Pearl Harbor only to become the apex predator of the South Pacific. But her location remained a mystery, lost in the chaotic geography of the Kula Gulf, a graveyard where the depth creates a pressurized tomb that crushes ordinary submersibles. There are unanswered questions surrounding her death. Survivors spoke of the ship refusing to sink, of a bow that floated on its own like a phantom vessel, and of a secret radar technology that gave her a supernatural ability to see in the dark. For 75 years, the ocean kept these secrets. Why did she break apart so violently? What happened to the classified equipment on board? And most importantly, does the wreck confirm the impossible stories told by the men who swam away? From her. If you want to see how this story unfolds, hit the like button. The ROV moves past the number 50, drifting toward the weapon mounts. The crew aboard the Petrel gasps. The guns are still trained out. Even in death, the Helena is ready to fight. But just beyond the turrets, the steel ends in a jagged, catastrophic tear. The ocean floor here is scattered with debris, but the rest of the ship is missing. The discovery has just begun, and the silence of the deep is about to be broken by the echoes of a battle that changed the course of World War II. To understand why the discovery of the USS Helena sent shockwaves through the naval history community, we must first understand the machine itself and the men who transformed her into a legend. Commissioned in late 1939, Helena was a Brooklyn-class light cruiser, but she was anything but light in terms of lethality. At 608 feet long and displacing over 10,000 tons, she was a floating fortress designed for one specific purpose. Volume of fire. She carried 15 6-inch guns housed in 5 triple turrets, a battery capable of putting 150 rounds per minute into the air. Her captain, Charles P. Cecil, was a man who understood the evolving nature of naval warfare better than his peers. While many commanders in 1942 were still clinging to the outdated doctrines of daylight battleship duels, Cecil was obsessed with a new, highly classified technology, the SG radar. He was 49 years old, a disciplinarian who drilled his crew relentlessly, not out of cruelty, but out of a prescient understanding that seconds would determine survival. The crew, 868 men strong, were a mix of career sailors and fresh recruits. But under Cecil's command, they merged into a single, cohesive organism. The historical situation in late 1942 was dire. The Pacific Fleet had been crippled at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Imperial Navy reigned supreme in the night, their optical sights and long-lance torpedoes decimating Allied fleets in the Solomons. The Guadalcanal campaign had turned into a meat grinder, a desperate attrition war where the average life expectancy of a sailor was measured in weeks. The U.S. Navy was losing the night war, blinded by darkness and outmatched by Japanese pyrotechnics. However, Helena was different. She was an anomaly in a losing fleet. While other ships stumbled in the dark, Helena could see. Her installation of the experimental SG radar gave her a god's eye view of the battlefield, a technological edge that was strictly top secret. But there were early signs that this advantage came with a terrible cost. The radar made her the fleet's pointer dog, the ship that always had to be at the front, leading the line, exposing her thin armor to the heaviest enemy fire. Rumors began to circulate among the fleet. Other crews noticed that Helena was always the first to fire, often before the enemy was even visible to the naked eye. This eerily accurate fire led to whispers of secret orders. The Navy wasn't just using Helena as a combat ship. They were using her as a live testing ground for a new doctrine of electronic warfare. She was being pushed to the absolute limit of her mechanical endurance. Her barrels were worn smooth from constant firing, her hull stressed by near-constant steaming at flank speed. What the public didn't know was that the Japanese High Command had issued specific orders regarding this rapid-fire devil. Intelligence intercepted from Tokyo suggested that destroying this specific cruiser had become a priority. They believed she possessed a new type of automatic weapon, a machine gun caliber that didn't exist in any naval registry. The enemy was hunting her specifically, looking for the muzzle flashes that bloomed like stroboscopes in the night. The stage was set for a confrontation where technology would collide with brute force. Helena was carrying the burden of the entire Pacific campaign's hope on her riveted decks. She was the only thing standing between the Japanese convoys and the vulnerable Marines on Guadalcanal. But as she steamed toward the Kula Gulf in July 1943, the crew sensed a shift. The missions were becoming more dangerous, the odds longer. They were walking into a trap, baiting the Tokyo Express to come out and fight. What they didn't know was that the trap would snap shut on them. And the very technology that made them invincible would also paint a target on their backs that no amount of armor could withstand. On the afternoon of July 5, 1943, the order came. Task Group 36.1, with Helena as the centerpiece, was to intercept a Tokyo Express reinforcement run headed for Vila. The official destination was the Kula Gulf, a narrow, treacherous body of water sandwiched between the volcanic peaks of Kalimanjaro and New Georgia. It was a restricted waterway, a tactical nightmare where maneuvering room was non-existent. The departure was tense. The sun dipped below the horizon at 18:42, plunging the Solomons into the ink-black darkness that the Japanese Navy owned. Helena steamed at 25 knots, her engines vibrating through the steel decks. The heat in the lower engineering spaces climbed past 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Below decks, men stripped to their waists, sweating over valves and gauges, the smell of oil and stale recycled air thick in their lungs. By 01:57 on July 6, the task group entered the Gulf. The silence was absolute save for the rhythmic wash of the bow cutting through the obsidian water. Then the SG radar screen in Captain Cecil's command center glowed. Green blips, enemy contacts, range, 11,000 yards. Two distinct groups of Japanese destroyers were racing down the slot. The obstacles were immediate. A rain squall moved in, reducing visibility to zero. The American destroyers were blinded, but Helena was not. She was the eyes of the fleet. At 01:59, her guns roared. The sound was not a sequence of bangs, but a continuous, rolling thunder. In the first 3 minutes of the engagement, Helena pumped out over 1,000 rounds of 6-inch ammunition. The Japanese destroyer Niizuki was obliterated before her crew could even man their battle stations, turned into a burning wreck by a deluge of high-explosive shells. But here the critical turning point occurred. The flashless powder, propellant designed to hide the ship's position in the dark, ran out. The gun crews working in a rhythmic trance of low-dram fire had to switch to standard smokeless powder. The difference was lethal. Every time Helena fired, massive tongues of yellow flame erupted from her turrets, illuminating the ship against the black background of the jungle. She became a lighthouse in a dark room. The Japanese destroyers Suzukaze and Tanikaze, hidden by the coastline, saw the light show. They didn't need radar, they just needed to aim at the fire. At 0203, they launched long-lance torpedoes, 24-inch oxygen-fueled killers carrying a 1,000-pound warhead. The wait for impact lasted moments but felt like hours. The torpedoes traveled at 48 knots. The first one struck Helena on the port side near the number 1 turret. The explosion shore off the bow completely. The noise was a deafening, metallic shriek, like the earth itself tearing open. 40 feet of the ship, from the nose to the first turret, simply vanished from the rest of the hull. Before the damage control teams could even stand up, the second and third torpedoes hit amidships. The structural spine of the cruiser snapped. The sheer violence of the impact threw men from their bunks and smashed instruments into bulkheads. The lights died instantly, replaced by the terrifying red glow of emergency battle lanterns. The arrival of death was immediate. The ship began to jackknife. The center section was flooding uncontrollably. Captain Cecil, realizing the catastrophic nature of the damage, gave the order, "Abandon ship." It was 0207, just 4 minutes after the first torpedo hit. But the ocean had more cruelty in store. As the men scrambled into the oil-slicked water, the bow section, the part that had been blown off first, didn't sink. It floated upright, bobbing in the swell. In the confusion, many sailors swam toward it, climbing onto the severed wreckage as if it were a life raft. The main hull, broken and groaning, began its final plunge. It slid beneath the surface at 0225, taking the bodies of the dead with it. For the survivors treading water in the shark-infested Kula Gulf, the battle was over, but the war for survival had just begun. They were surrounded by enemy islands, covered in toxic fuel oil, and the Japanese destroyers were swinging back around to finish the job. In the days following the sinking, a strange silence descended over the official records. The Navy was in a precarious position. The loss of Helena was a devastating blow, both strategically and to morale. She was the hero ship, the invincible machine gun, admitting she had been cracked open in minutes. By a few destroyers was not a narrative the High Command wanted to publicize immediately. The investigation began even before the survivors were found. Intelligence officers scrutinized the after-action reports of the other ships in the task group. They asked uncomfortable questions. Why was Helena the only target hit? Had the radar emissions acted as a homing beacon? There were whispers of a tactical error, a failure to screen the cruiser properly. But the most baffling reports came from the reconnaissance planes flying over Kula Gulf the next morning. Pilots reported seeing a ghost ship. They saw the bow of the Helena, still floating, drifting aimlessly with her hull number 50, pointing toward the sky. It refused to sink. For days, this severed section confused Japanese patrols who wasted ammunition bombing a wreck that was already dead. The U.S. Navy kept this detail quiet. The image of their great warship reduced to a piece of drifting flotsam was too grim for the newsreels. Meanwhile, the survivors were living a hidden nightmare. Over 165 men were clinging to that floating bow. As the air slowly leaked out, the wreckage sank lower. They had to abandon it, constructing crude rafts from debris. They drifted for days, currents pulling them toward the enemy-held island of Vella La Vella. This is where the story vanished into the jungle. For weeks, these men were effectively erased from the war. They hid in the dense foliage, aided by courageous local coast watchers and natives who risked execution to feed them. The Japanese patrols were hunting them. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse. The sailors, sun-scorched and starving, had to remain invisible. If they were captured, they would be tortured for information about the radar technology the Japanese were desperate to understand. Back in the States, families received telegrams, "Missing in action." The ambiguity was agonizing. The file on Helena remained open but stagnant. Investigators who processed the survivors after their eventual, miraculous rescue noted inconsistencies. Men spoke of the ship breaking in ways that didn't match the standard structural models. They spoke of the machine gun firing until the very last second, a detail that seemed impossible given the speed of the sinking. As the years turned into decades, the truth of exactly how Helena died was buried under the general history of the Solomons campaign. The survivors returned home, married, took factory jobs, and raised families. They lived the facade of a normal post-war life. But in quiet moments at reunions held in VFW halls, they whispered about the fourth torpedo or the failure of the flashless powder. The official Navy history closed the book. The wreck was considered lost forever, too deep to verify, the details of her final moments relegated to memory. Investigators moved on to other cases. The location was marked on charts with a vague circle miles wide. The technology that Helena pioneered became standard, and the ship herself became a footnote. The secret died with him, or so they thought. August 2018. The RV Petrel team, funded by the estate of Paul Allen, begins a systematic grid search of the Kula Gulf. They are armed with the finest underwater survey technology on the planet. Multi-beam sonar capable of mapping the seafloor with centimeter precision, and a heavy-duty ROV equipped with 4K cameras. The team is looking for magnetic anomalies, disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field caused by thousands of tons of steel. For days, the monitors show nothing but the endless, flat desert of the abyss. Then the sonar paints a smear, a debris field. It is massive, stretching over hundreds of meters. The ROV is launched. Layer 1, the debris field. The first reveal is not the ship, but the violence of her death. The cameras glide over a chaotic scattering of artifacts. 5-inch shell casings, twisted piping, and personal gear. A boot, a ceramic plate. These are the crumbs left by the breakup. It confirms that the ship didn't just sink, she was torn apart. The distribution suggests a violent explosion while the ship was still moving at high speed, corroborating the jackknife theory survivors had spoken of for 70 years. Layer 2, the stern and the guns. The ROV pushes forward and the massive stern section looms out of the dark. This is the first major shock. The number 50 is visible, confirming the identity, but the camera pans up to the aft turrets. The guns are trained to the port side, locked in the firing position. This is physical proof of the crew's heroism. They were tracking targets even as the water rose around them. The forensic analysis of the gun barrels shows extreme heat discoloration, evidence of the machine gun rate of fire that ultimately doomed them by creating the muzzle flash beacon. Layer 3, the missing midships. As the ROV follows the hull forward, the steel ends abruptly. The midship section, where the engineering spaces were located, is a mangled ruin. This confirms the second and third torpedo impacts. The steel is bent inward, a classic signature of external warhead detonation. This silences the fringe theories of an internal magazine explosion. The Japanese long lances did exactly what they were designed to do: break the ship's back. Layer 4, the bridge and the radar. The team maneuvers the ROV to the bridge wreckage. Here lies the vindication of Captain Cecil. The SG radar antenna, the secret device that gave Helena her edge, is visible. It is battered but recognizable. Its position indicates it was active and rotating until the power failed. This piece of twisted metal represents the technological leap that eventually won the war in the Pacific. But container number X held something that changed everything. The final reveal: the severed bow. The team finds the bow section. It is lying nearly half a kilometer away from the main wreckage. This spatial separation is the smoking gun. It proves the survivor accounts that the bow floated away and drifted independently. It wasn't just a war story, it was physics. The bow is sitting upright on the sea floor, dignified and detached. The anchor chains are still stowed. The damage at the break point is surgically clean, the result of the first torpedo hitting the structural weak point at frame 30. This final discovery connects the underwater archaeology to the human survival story. The bow didn't just break, it became a life raft. The distance it traveled from the main wreck validates the harrowing journey of the 165 men who rode it like a raft before swimming for the islands. The forensic evidence aligns perfectly with the impossible tales of the old sailors. The ocean had finally given up the truth. The discovery of the USS Helena is more than just finding a shipwreck. It is a recalibration of our understanding of the Guadalcanal campaign. Historically, Helena was often overshadowed by the larger battleships or the carriers, but the wreck proves that Helena was the linchpin of the surface fleet. The condition of the guns and the position of the radar antenna reshape what we thought we knew about American night-fighting doctrine. For years, historians believed the U.S. Navy was purely reactive in these battles. The physical evidence shows a ship that was aggressively offensive. Helena wasn't caught by surprise. She was fighting a sophisticated, radar-directed battle until she ran out of the technology, flashless powder, that kept her hidden. It vindicates the investigators who argued that logistics, not tactics, caused her loss. If she had more flashless powder, she might have survived the night. This explains why the Japanese were so terrified of her. The sheer volume of shell casings found on the sea floor around the wreck site supports the Japanese reports of automatic fire. Helena wasn't just shooting. She was putting up a wall of steel that no other ship of her class could match. She was operating beyond the design limits of her class, pushed by a crew that knew their only defense was offense. The discovery also validates the dismissed accounts of the phantom bow. For decades, skeptics questioned how a non-buoyant steel section could float for so long. The wreck analysis shows that the watertight bulkheads in the bow held firm, trapping a bubble of air that kept the steel afloat long enough to save 165 lives. It vindicates the memories of men who were often told their trauma had exaggerated the events. Furthermore, this discovery links to the wider escape network of the Solomons. The survival of the Helena crew on Vela La Vela forced the Navy to perfect its rescue operations, leading to the sophisticated Dumbo flying boat rescue missions that saved hundreds of other pilots and sailors later in the war. The Helena disaster was the catalyst for better survival gear and better rescue protocols. We now know that the machine gun cruiser didn't die in vain. She absorbed 3 torpedoes that were likely meant for the transports she was protecting. She took the blow for the fleet. The truth is that Helena was a sacrificial pawn played by a command that knew she was the only piece on the board capable of holding the line. Among the debris field, the ROV cameras spotted items that brought the colossal scale of the tragedy down to a human level. A pair of wire-rimmed spectacles resting in the silt. A shaving kit with the mirror still intact. These personal artifacts serve as a poignant reminder that the Helena was not just a machine of war, but a home to 868 young men. Captain Cecil did not survive the war to see his ship found. He died in a plane crash shortly after his command of Helena. But for the families of the 168 men who went down with the ship, the images from the bottom of Kula Gulf offered a funeral service 75 years overdue. The ship is a war grave, protected by law and by the depth of the ocean. "It brings a sense of peace," said one descendant of a Helena survivor viewing the footage. "My grandfather always talked about the noise, the terrible noise of the guns and the screaming metal. Seeing her sitting there in the silence, it feels like she can finally rest." The discovery bridges the gap between the horrific memories of the survivors and the sterile history books. It proves that their struggle was real, their fear was justified, and their ship was every bit the legend they claimed she was. Sometimes the ocean preserves what history forgets. In the end, the USS Helena was more than steel and rivets. She was the embodiment of a desperate time when the world teetered on the edge of darkness. She was the shield that cracked so the rest of the fleet could hold. As the ROV lights fade and the camera pulls back into the gloom, the number 50 disappears once again into the shadows of the iron bottom sound. The robotic arm retracts, leaving the machine gun cruiser to her eternal vigil. She lies broken but unbowed, her guns still pointing toward an enemy that no longer exists, in a war that ended long ago. The wreck remains at 860 meters, a silent monument to the ferocity of the night battles of 1943. She is the ship that wouldn't die, the ghost that finally allowed herself to be found.